Alright, fuckers and fuckettes. This morning, we're going to talk about something that I've got direct experience with because I'm the guy, I'll go down, I'll sit with the homeless people down there by the docks, and I sit out behind the liquor store. I'll buy them a bottle of wine or a couple of cheeseburgers, and I sit there and I listen to their stories. To me, it's well worth every penny, buying them a bottle of wine, making them happy for a while, whatever. I don't give them cash unless I know that they're really trying, and I gotta actually have, more than a couple of dollars in my pocket at the time. But the Real ID Act has increased the homeless problem. You see, on a separate but very related thing, back in 1986, what the federal government did, they were trying to curb immigration, illegal immigration, so their heart was in the right place. However, they screwed a lot of Americans. I mean, statistically, we know of about 2 million people that act, and that information is really old, so I mean, it's probably more than that. But we know of about 2 million Americans born here in America that Immigration Act has caused people to be homeless because you have to have a picture ID and 2 other forms of ID to legally work in the United States. Now, I personally know one kid. I let him use my address to get his birth certificate and shit, so that he could work. But it took 6 to 8 weeks, and I mean the whole time the kid's living on the streets. He can't work for nobody other than for cash. After he got that, he had to go down to Social Security. He had to get his school records or something too. Enough to where he could get his Social Security card back, you see, because he had lost his ID, and he was already homeless to begin with. Due to hard times or whatever. But in order to get his ID back, he had to jump through all these hoops. And he finally got his birth certificate, and I think it was his military records. I don't think it was his school records. I think it was his DD-214. And then he went down to Social Security, and he was able to get a receipt thingy saying that he had applied to get his Social Security card back, and that was his number, and that was good enough for him to be able to work on. But like I said, that took a couple of months just to get that in, and then it took him another week or so. He found work right away. I mean, the whole time, like I said, the kid was living in the fucking mangroves down by the docks. I ain't gonna say which docks because I don't want the sheriff running them people out of there. Because that's all they got. And they are people. And they ain't hurting nobody, they ain't bothering nobody, so, I mean, if they're down there, I don't give a shit. And, it ain't nobody's place to run them out, it's public land. But now that you've got this Real ID Act, they've made it even harder. Because in order to work, one of the requirements is that you have that picture ID. Well, to get a picture ID now, you need an original birth certificate with a seal on it. And you got people like me, there is no birth certificate. I was born in a fucking house. Oh shit, there goes that goddamn phone. Okay, so anyway, now that damn phone call's over, with this Real ID Act, you need a picture ID, of course. To get a picture ID, you need 6 forms of ID. And you've got people like me, there is no birth certificate. Period. I was born in a house. There's no certificate of baptism on my Jewish ass. And the only saving grace is the fact that I've somehow managed to keep enough ID. I've got to get some of it replaced, but this Real ID Act is fucking a lot of people. I am not one of them. I know how to run a cash business. I'm not fucking worried about it. I turn wrenches on motorcycles. But I'm seeing the work corners, you know, the corners where it used to be all Mexicans, you know, they'd go down there and they'd stand there and the trucks would come pick them up and they'd go to work for a day in exchange for cash. I'm seeing those corners are not filled up with illegals anymore. Those corners are filled up with white folks and black folks with southern accents and Yankee accents. You know, and I mean, some of their situations are they had lost their ID and, you know, they weren't really too concerned about getting it replaced before they got a fucking, you know, new job. You know, they had a job, they weren't concerned about it, and then they lost their job, or their girlfriend kicked them out, or their husband kicked them out, and then they had to start the process of replacing their ID with no address, and which is really impossible to do, because there's not very many people like me in this world that will let somebody use their address to get their ID, unless you know them or something. But to me, I mean, hey, you know, if they want to use my address to get their shit sent so that they can get their life right, hey, that tells me they're trying. I'm going to help them any way I can, because I'd rather see people working and not on fucking welfare. But, you know, they can't even get welfare without ID these days. I mean, I don't think they can even get food stamps. It's just one of those things. Then you've got, this is South Florida, we have a lot of old people. Some of those old people are Holocaust survivors. There's no birth certificate on them. When they go to renew their license, they ain't gonna get it next time. Yeah, I got my Uniformed Services ID card back the other day. Still got my Alabama motorcycle license, so I mean, I'm good for the basics. Strangely enough, the ID that I have isn't enough to get a replacement for my Social Security card, but you know, I know the number and I'm not working for anybody. I work for cash. Well, okay, I'll take guns too. I mean, whatever people want to pay me in. But mostly, I mean, if I work on your bike, you're paying me cash. I'm not taking no goddamn checks, because I did that years ago and I had checks from doctors that bounced, so I just won't take them. But, you know, and credit cards, that's too damn much hassle. I don't want to wait 6 weeks for my money. But anyway, back to the homeless people, this Real ID Act is creating, I mean, probably 1 in 4 of the homeless people that I talk to on a regular basis, they are homeless because they can't legally work. You know, whatever circumstance, whether they were thrown out by their husband or wife or girlfriend, boyfriend, or whether they had a job and just didn't replace their ID, and then they started to replace their ID and in the meantime lost their damn apartment, you know, because they didn't start replacing their ID until after they had lost their job. I think that's pretty fucked up right there. And I mean, you know, it's a good thing, because the homeless people will share you. I'm not saying it's a good thing, this Real ID Act. I'm not saying that Immigration Act was a good thing. What I'm saying is it's a good thing that the homeless people share information with each other, you know, because there's still fruit harvesters that'll hire for cash. There's still, you know, some of them, you know, they'll work for landscapers and, you know, nurseries, anything they can for cash under the table. And they're American citizens. They're not illegal aliens, so I don't think anybody's doing anything wrong in hiring them and paying them cash. It gets them on their feet. The government sees it a little bit different. That's actually illegal, and they could be fined a shitload of money. But anyway, the federal government really doesn't have any place. I think the government has overstepped their bounds with this Real ID Act, because, I mean, if somebody is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, or brown-haired, brown-eyed, I don't know how to describe African Americans without getting in any trouble like that, you know, so that's brown hair, brown-eyed, we're gonna go with that. You know, and they're speaking with a Southern or a Yankee or an American accent, they should have the right to work whether they've got ID or not. And that's just plain and simple. You know, and I mean, there are states like Alabama, they can work 3 days at a time out of the labor halls without ID. And there's a lot of them, you know, like down here I see these people getting picked up by the fruit harvest folks, and there's a lot of people that just ain't built for that kind of work. You know, they'll go out there, they won't last a day, but at least they'll have enough, you know, at the end of the day that they can eat good for a day or two. And, you know, unfortunately, I'm seeing very few lawsuits floating around about this, attacking it from this angle. And, you know, the government themselves has created a lot of homeless people. And like I say, I mean, the information I had on the 2 million that were caused by the Immigration Act of 1986, that's really old information. And it's probably a lot higher by now. And now that this Real ID shit is kicked in, hell, I know people that cannot even renew their fucking driver's license. Can't even get a picture ID. Which, you gotta have it to fucking work. You gotta have a picture ID and 2 other forms of ID to work. And, you know, the government never considered when they made these laws, hey, you know, it takes 6 to 8 weeks just to send off for a birth certificate, unless you happen to be in the same city that you were born in, which most people aren't. I mean, a lot of people are, but most people aren't. I mean, even when I was in Alabama, fuck, they'd always have to send off Montgomery and get their birth certificate, whatever. And that's the ones that were born in Alabama. And back then, man, fuck, 2 to 3 months was a more realistic number. And in the meantime, you know, those people were not allowed to work. So the government has way overstepped their bounds with both of those laws, and that Real ID Act is creating a whole lot more homeless people. You can go on any work corner in Miami, Tampa, Sarasota, Fort Myers, and you're not seeing illegals on them work corners. What you're seeing is white folks and black folks that you know damn well are Americans, and that's the only work that they can get. And the bad thing is even though the homeless people do share information, a lot of times it takes them a while before one homeless person meets another that has that information as to where these work corners are and stuff like that. And, you know, I've seen people, there's one lady, she was on the streets for over a year before she got her ID straightened out to where she could work. She's working out of the labor hall down in Port Charlotte right now. She's been working there a couple of months, and she's almost got enough money to get an apartment. But, you know, that whole time that she was living on the streets, that woman does not look good enough to be turning tricks for cash. Nor is she young enough. And we have a problem with the government doesn't realize when they write these laws who all they're going to affect. And to me, I just don't think it's right. I think every American, whether they have ID, whether they even want ID or not, should be able to work, period. Without some stupid law stopping them. You know, I mean, that's not just creating jobless, that's creating homeless. Which I don't think is right. And what I'm seeing, you know, when I go down to the docks, I would say 1 in 4 people down there are out of work because of this Real ID Act, because they can't get their ID replaced, and it has caused them to lose their place, or they lost their place and just didn't have ID, or in the cases of a couple of them, which, I mean, you know, 1 or 2 of them were in jail for 90 days for a little petty shit, and they didn't have their ID with them when they got arrested. Well, in the meantime, they lose their apartment and shit. You know, 90 days for a public drunk or something, whatever. Meantime, they lose their apartment, they lose their job, they got nothing, they get out, they ain't got no more ID, and it takes a couple of months to replace that, if they have an address to replace it to, which most of them that I'm talking to don't. And then, you know, there's a few real actual felons in the mix that, you know, I mean, one guy, he had like $12,000 in bad checks. He's trying to make his life right, but he can't due to he can't get his ID. They give him a prison discharge ID. He discharged his number, finished his prison sentence. He didn't take the mandatory parole. You know, he just didn't have a place to parole to, and he didn't want to do the halfway house, and he straight up told him, hey, look, you put me out there, I'm not going to report to anyone, which I can see his point. I definitely can see his point. I wouldn't want to do that either. Hell, you're on the streets, you know, and your conditions of parole are, you got to have a place to live and a job, and he's not able to get either. But that parole discharge ID that they gave him isn't even good enough to go get a Social Security card or welfare or nothing. It's probably good enough to cash a paycheck, but until his birth certificate comes in, he can't take that and go down and get a copy of his Social Security card, which he has to have to work. To me, these laws that they've put on the books in regards to that are bullshit. I understand that the Immigration Act of '86 was put in place to, you know, get cut down on the number of illegals, but it's been affecting Americans for years. I've known about it for years. I've heard the horror stories for years and years and years. I've let people use my address to get their ID and shit. You know, and I can get mine. I've got enough fucking paperwork and shit, I can get mine finally. But it sucks that the government would do that shit. And now with this Real ID Act, they've made it so fucking impossible. You cannot, you know, to get that picture ID, I mean, they want proof that you've been a resident for 4 or 5 years. A lot of these homeless people ain't a resident of nowhere for, you know, they ain't got no old copies of their mail. They're more worried about keeping their goddamn clothes with them so they don't lose what little they do got. But, alright, I've said my piece on that. Holler at y'all fuckers and fuckheads later.